Greetings, comrades! For the last few days, everyone's been talking about the meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin set for August 15th. In the great state of Alaska, as Trump put it, and in a perfectly logical place, as Russian presidential aide Ushakov replied. This is a historic event, as the last time the US and Russian presidents met was back in 2021, in a different reality, so to speak. But today, of course, we are not talking about modern politics, the causes and implications of this meeting, but about its location. After all, Alaska is not just a convenient place for the presidents to meet. It is the northernmost state of the US and the territory where an actual physical border between the two countries runs, right through the Bering Strait. There is also a historical subtext. Alaska is also a land that was officially part of the Russian Empire for more than 60 years. And then was sold to the US for a pittance, just a few years before huge reserves of gold and oil were discovered there. So, how did all this happen? How did the Russian Empire even get a piece of land in North America in the first place? In fact, it was Russians who discovered Alaska for Europeans, for Western civilization. Usually English sources say that Vitus Bering was the first to discover it in 1741. But some authors claim that members of the Gvozdiev and Fedorov expedition visited the peninsula 9 years earlier, on August 21, 1732. Although Russian travelers began approaching the western lands of North America back in the 17th century. The first of our compatriots to set foot on the shores of Alaska may have been the sailors of the expedition led by Cossack and explorer Semyon Dezhnev. In 1648, his ships successfully passed through the straits separating Eurasia from America, which 80 years later would be named the Bering Strait. Several ships were lost during the journey on the open sea. Some historians still believe that the lost sailors may have reached the shores of Alaska and found refuge with the local inhabitants, and then founded their own settlement, the mythical village of Kingavei. But let's return from myths to reality. Alaska turned out to be rich in fur-bearing animals, and fur was Russia's main export commodity at the time, a kind of 18th century oil. One local sea otter's skin was worth as much as a good horse. Therefore, when news of new lands in the north reached St. Petersburg, it was quickly decided to explore and develop Alaska. Local hunters were often hired to hunt sea otters, which were then resold. Russia firmly established itself on the American continent in the fall of 1784, when Irkutsk merchant Grigory Shelikhov founded a small settlement on Kodiak Island. 5 years later, Novoarkhangelsk, now Sitka, was founded as the capital of Russian Alaska, and in 1788, Alaska officially became a territory of the Russian Empire. In the same year, the Russian-American Company was formed, essentially an exact copy of the British East India Company, a monopolist in Russian exploration of North America. Of course, a private business of this size and power was under strict state control, but it was the merchants who ruled there. Settlements grew and developed, business flourished, and Russian settlers managed to teach the indigenous population cattle breeding and agriculture, thanks to which they acquired their own vegetable gardens and domestic animals. Schools and churches were built. For more than 50 years, the Russian Empire successfully explored uncharted lands, and then, for some reason, sold them to the United States for a pittance. According to some patriotic members of Russian society, the Alaska episode remains one of the most cursed in Russian history, similar to Khrushchev's transfer of Crimea to Ukraine. Russia successfully ruled over a vast territory in North America, peacefully bringing culture to the local indigenous peoples, and then for some reason simply gave up this territory. Damned liberals tricked Emperor Alexander II into selling our colony. The Americans took advantage of this and effectively got Alaska for free, then drained it of all its gold and oil. Moreover, it is sometimes claimed that Russia did not even receive the agreed-upon money for the sale. So, let's first talk about whether Russia had any reason to sell its territory on the third continent. First, of course, not all local residents were thrilled that Russian merchants and manufacturers were using their land and hunting their animals. And, of course, it's obvious that Russian industrialists were far from being saints, and the colonization of Alaska was far from being as peaceful as it's commonly portrayed in Soviet and Russian historiography. Indigenous uprisings occurred throughout the entire history of Russian Alaska. In 1802, the Tlingit captured Mikhailovskaya fortress. In the winter of 1803, they attacked a Russian reconnaissance group near the Copper River, and in 1805 they captured the Yakutat fortress. Even in the 1850s, they did not give up their attempts to capture Novoarkhangelsk. Therefore, Russia had to spend a lot of money to ensure the security of its overseas territory. But the profits from the fur trade covered all expenses until the middle of the century, when all the sea otters along the coast were killed off and the profits of the Russian-American company declined year after year. The second reason was geopolitical. In the 1850s, the Amur expedition was a great success. Russian explorers mastered the lands of the Amur River region, Kamchatka and Sakhalin, which were much closer to Russia. In addition, officials wrote to the capital about their strategic importance. These were border territories with access to the ocean. Again, the Industrial Revolution had not yet fully reached Russia, and there was not much money in the treasury. Sooner or later, Russia had to choose which lands to prioritize. The emperor was more interested in the Black Sea Straits, the Caucasus and Central Asia. In addition, against the backdrop of growing anti-Russian sentiment in Europe, there were fears that in the event of war, the British would easily capture defenseless Alaska. And this almost happened during the Crimean War. Fortunately, shortly before the war, Russia, anticipating such a possibility, offered to fictitiously transfer the ships and all the company's property to the United States for 3 years. So in 1853, the British recognized the neutral status of the Russian-American company's property, but still requisitioned the fur trade. This, incidentally, is the origin of the myth that Russia did not actually sell Alaska to the United States, but only leased it for 99 years and they will have to return it. Thus, 14 years before the sale of Alaska, the peninsula was only barely saved from being captured by Great Britain, and there was increasing talk that the colony should be disposed of. The main initiator of the sale of Alaska was the younger brother of Emperor Alexander II, Grand Duke Konstantin Nikolaevich. In 1857 he wrote a memo arguing that Russian America had become practically useless. Yes, it was still profitable, but every year it became more difficult to defend. The British didn't really need it that much, but the Americans, whose country was rapidly expanding, did. And if they decided to seize Alaska, Russia would not be able to fight back. It was better to focus on developing the Pacific coast from the Asian side. Moreover, this would help strengthen the potential alliance between Russia and the United States. In addition, after 3 years of the Crimean War, the state treasury was severely depleted. Money was urgently needed to build a railway network, and all traditional sources of income had been exhausted. The only salvation was foreign loans. But the Russian emperor was not ready to start begging for arms, and it was not yet clear whether European partners would agree to grant a loan. In this situation, an idea emerged. If there's not enough money in the treasury, something unneeded should be sold. And what was unneeded by the Russian Empire? That's right, Alaska. During 70 years of Russian ownership of this vast territory, they did not even bother to establish a local government administration, which is the best illustration of the attitude of Russian emperors towards this distant province. There was just one tiny problem. The Americans had no plans or desire to buy Alaska, a pile of ice and rocks. The situation was exacerbated by the outbreak of the Civil War in the United States, which left Washington with a devastated financial system and no interest in Alaska. The Russian Empire was forced to send its envoys to work among the American political elite, spending almost 10 years convincing them of the benefits of buying Alaska. According to one version, $144,000 even had to be given as bribes to senators and the head of the US Treasury Department for lobbying the deal. The purchase itself in 1867 happened very quickly, literally 3 weeks after President Johnson was first officially informed that the Russians wanted to sell the land. Russia received $7.2 million in gold for the sale of Alaska. At the exchange rate at the time, that was 11 million rubles, a very modest sum given Russia's annual budget of 400 million. Russia spent most of it on building railways in the Central Empire. It is said that if the Russians had not rushed to sell and had concluded the deal 10 years later, they could have demanded 5 times the amount they received. But the money was needed immediately. So, how can we know whether 7.2 million was a lot or a little? It is often said that the New York state government paid more for a single building in downtown New York than it did for Alaska. But for a more in-depth comparison, let's look at how much it cost the United States to get new territories in the 19th century. In 1845, the Republic of Texas became a part of the United States and they had to cover the foreign debt of the Republic – 7.75 million. According to the first and oldest census in the history of the Republic of Texas, its territory was 389,166 square miles in 1840. The area of Alaska at the time of its sale was estimated at 586,412 square miles. It turns out that Alaska was bought at the price of $12.3 per square mile, while Texas cost the American treasury $19.9 per square mile, so 1.5 times more expensive. Given the difference in geographical location, it is difficult to argue that Alaska was undervalued. The US spent $15 million on the Louisiana purchase, $18 per square mile, more expensive than Alaska and slightly cheaper than Texas, but the numbers are of the same order in all cases. Correlating this amount to the GDP of the US in 1867 and at the current time, we can estimate that today the sale price of Alaska would be $16.2 billion. That seems like a lot, but it's still not that impressive. However, we should also take into account the fact that Washington would hardly agree to pay more. The American press laughed at the purchase of the polar bear garden for another 10 years, deeming the purchase absolutely useless. This continued until 1880, when Richard Harris and Joseph Juneau found a nugget of gold in Gold Creek, turning Alaska into the mecca of gold prospectors. And then, as you know, Americans would go on to find gold in Alaska worth 2,500 times more than the purchase price, and then discover rich oil reserves, instantly turning it into one of the most valuable territories in the United States. It is clear that now its value, if the US suddenly went insane and started selling its territories, would be trillions of dollars, but 150 years ago, 7.2 million seemed like a normal deal. Nevertheless, 150 years later, the deal itself certainly looks like a huge victory for the US and a failure for Russia. This has given rise to numerous conspiracy theories. The most popular is that the United States knew in advance about the gold riches in Alaska and could not believe their luck when they were offered to buy it. But the Russians also knew about the gold. Its traces were first discovered in 1848. We simply did not have the manpower for large-scale development. Others argue that the real reason for the sale was that Emperor's brother Constantine was tasked with developing the fleet, but he had neither the talent nor the desire to do so. Therefore, he decided that if there was no Alaska, there would be no need for a developed fleet, and convinced his brother to sell the burden. According to another popular myth, the money for Alaska was never received. It was allegedly sent to St. Petersburg on a ship that sank en route. There are also opinions that the day when the sale took place was also the end of the powers of the US House of Representatives, and the decision on the treaty on the US side was made by just the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee. That is why many ultra-patriotic modern activists demand that the 1867 treaty be declared annulled and Alaska be returned to Russia. But I think you understand that this is absolutely impossible. Although Trump did say in his statement about the meeting that they would discuss the return and exchange of territories. What if... Thanks for watching, and as always, a huge shout out to my biggest supporters: Yelizaveta Zakharova, Kirill, Klimuk, Böse, Petar, Ilic, Marina Holiday, Lyudmila, Ilyanova, and one more member who wished to remain anonymous. See you guys next time.